September 1944. Third Army has torn through 400 miles of French countryside in just 30 days, an advanced military theorist declared impossible. Now Patton's columns stand at the threshold of the Reich itself, the first American forces poised to set foot on German soil since the war began. But the soldiers aren't celebrating. They're exhausted, running on fumes, and seething with frustration that their spectacular thrust has been strangled not by enemy resistance, but by empty fuel tanks and supply failures hundreds of miles behind them. When they finally cross into Germany, their words won't be triumphant. They'll ask one question that cuts through all the glory and headlines. Why did we stop? This is the story of the greatest advance of World War II, and the men who executed it, told through their own letters, diaries, and documented statements. These weren't propaganda pieces or official reports sanitized for public consumption. These were raw, unfiltered accounts from soldiers who had just rewritten the rules of modern warfare and couldn't understand why they were being forced to halt within sight of final victory. On August 1st, 1944, Third Army became operational in Normandy under Patton's command. Within days, his forces exploded in multiple directions simultaneously. West into Brittany, south toward the Loire, east toward Paris, north to trap German forces in the Falaise pocket. The speed was unprecedented, overwhelming. Third Army wasn't just moving fast. It was covering distances so quickly that German defensive planning became obsolete before staff officers could finish writing the orders. Soldiers who had spent weeks grinding through Norman hedgerows suddenly found themselves in open country where American advantages in mobility and firepower could be unleashed without constraint. One tank commander from the 4th Armored Division wrote home describing the advance as unlike anything he had experienced in training or previous combat. They were moving so fast that maps became outdated before they could be properly studied. Towns marked as objectives on operational maps were already in American hands by the time units received orders to capture them. Infantry soldiers riding on tanks to keep pace with armored columns expressed mixed feelings about the breakneck speed. Some welcomed it because it meant less time under enemy fire, fewer casualties than the static nightmare of hedgerow warfare. Others worried that moving too fast created dangerous vulnerabilities. Long supply lines stretched thin and exposed. Flanks left open. Units becoming separated from supporting formations. One sergeant from the 80th Infantry Division wrote in his diary that his company had advanced 30 miles in a single day, bypassing German strongpoints that follow-on units would have to reduce. The terrain they were covering so quickly would have to be fought for again, just by different men. The competition between American armies became apparent almost immediately. Third Army soldiers were acutely aware that other American and British forces were also racing across France. Patton made no secret of his obsession with beating everyone to Paris, to the Rhine, and ultimately to Berlin. He told his staff repeatedly that Third Army had two enemies: the Germans and other Allied headquarters that might slow their advance through caution or bureaucratic interference. This competitive fire filtered down through the ranks like electricity. Soldiers took fierce pride in their division's reputation for speed and aggressive action. They wanted to be first. First to Paris. First to the German border. First into Berlin. It became personal, a matter of unit honor that went beyond simple military objectives. But the rapid advance was creating severe logistical strain that would soon become catastrophic. Armored divisions consumed fuel at staggering rates. A single division required 73,000 gallons just to move 100 miles. Third Army had multiple armored divisions racing simultaneously in different directions. The logistics system designed to support these operations was the Red Ball Express, a dedicated trucking operation that moved supplies forward from Normandy beaches. At its peak, 6,000 trucks operated around the clock on one-way routes stretching hundreds of miles. Yet consumption exceeded delivery. Fuel shortages were inevitable, and they were coming fast. By late August, soldiers began noticing the warning signs. Tank crews watched their fuel gauges dropped to critical levels with growing anxiety. Artillery units started conserving ammunition because resupply convoys were delayed or diverted. Maintenance crews struggled to keep vehicles running with declining stocks of spare parts that should have been plentiful. One tank platoon leader wrote that his unit had stopped, not because of German resistance, but because they literally ran out of gas. His tanks sat immobilized for 3 days, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for fuel trucks to reach their position. The advance toward Paris showcased both Third Army's extraordinary capabilities and its fundamental challenges. Elements of Third Army reached the outskirts of Paris in late August, but the honor of liberating the city was given to Free French forces under General Philippe Leclerc. American soldiers who had raced across France to reach Paris first expressed bitter frustration that they were being held back for political reasons. They understood the symbolic importance of French forces liberating their own capital, the propaganda value, the emotional necessity. But after weeks of continuous combat and rapid movement, some felt their accomplishment was being diminished, their sacrifice not receiving proper recognition. On August 25th, Paris was liberated. The celebration was genuine and deeply moving. French civilians poured into streets embracing American soldiers, offering food and wine, expressing gratitude that made the hardships of combat seem worthwhile for a brief moment. But Third Army soldiers interviewed by war correspondents during the liberation made one thing absolutely clear. They were not stopping in Paris. Their objective remained the German border and ultimately Berlin. The liberation of Paris was significant, historic, but for Third Army it was a waypoint rather than a destination. They had come too far and fought too hard to stop now. By early September 1944, Third Army's spectacular advance ground to a complete halt, not because of German resistance, because there was no fuel. The numbers told a brutal story that enraged every soldier who understood what they meant. On August 31st, Third Army received just 32,000 gallons of fuel, barely enough to move one armored division 25 miles. Patton had requested 400,000 gallons, the amount he calculated would allow continued advance to the Rhine. The shortfall wasn't a temporary problem. It reflected fundamental limitations of the Allied logistics system that would persist for months. The soldiers' reactions to the fuel crisis revealed growing fury at what they perceived as catastrophic strategic failures by higher command. Letters and diary entries from this period expressed anger that their advance had been stopped by supply problems rather than enemy action. One infantry officer wrote that his battalion had fought from Normandy to the Meuse River without being stopped by Germans, only to be halted by lack of fuel for supporting tanks. He questioned why logistics had not been better prepared for the rapid advance everyone knew was possible after the Normandy breakout. Tank crews experienced the fuel crisis most directly and most dangerously. Armored vehicles immobilized for lack of fuel became sitting targets for German artillery and air attacks. Crews had to establish defensive positions around their disabled vehicles while waiting for resupply that might take days to arrive. One tank commander described the psychological torture of sitting immobilized within sight of the German border, knowing that if they had fuel, they could be across the Rhine before German defenses could be properly organized. The opportunity was there, visible, slipping away with each passing hour. The competition between American armies for limited fuel supplies created tensions that filtered down to the soldier level and festered. Third Army troops learned that fuel they desperately needed was being allocated to Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group for Operation Market Garden. Soldiers who had fought continuously since Normandy, who had bled across France, resented that British forces whom they perceived as slower and more cautious were receiving supply priority. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, embedded with Third Army during this period, documented soldiers' complaints about what they considered profoundly unfair allocation decisions that were costing American lives. Patton made his frustration explosively clear to anyone who would listen, and his attitude shaped how soldiers understood their situation. According to witnesses who heard him, Patton told General Omar Bradley that his men could eat their belts, but his tanks had to have gas. He argued that every day of delay allowed Germans to strengthen defenses and would cost American lives later when those same German units had to be fought from prepared positions. Soldiers heard these arguments from their own officers and agreed with them completely. But not all soldiers blamed logistics or high command for the halt. Some recognized that the advance had been unsustainably fast, and that pausing to consolidate was militarily prudent, regardless of supply issues. One company commander wrote to his family that while he understood soldiers' frustration, he believed the halt actually benefited Third Army by allowing exhausted troops to rest, damaged equipment to be repaired, and replacements to join depleted units. He noted that continuous combat from Normandy had reduced some rifle companies to half strength or worse. The pause also gave soldiers time to process what they had accomplished. In just 30 days, Third Army had advanced 400 miles, liberated territory containing millions of French civilians, destroyed multiple German divisions, and captured tens of thousands of prisoners. The scale of achievement was unprecedented in modern warfare. Yet soldiers interviewed during early September expressed less satisfaction about what they had accomplished than burning frustration about what they believed they could still accomplish if given adequate supplies. The German border was visible from forward American positions. Soldiers could see the fortifications of the Siegfried Line in the distance through their binoculars. Intelligence reports indicated that German defenses were still being organized, incomplete, that breakthrough might be possible if Third Army attacked immediately. The opportunity seemed obvious to soldiers who had spent weeks exploiting German disorganization and collapse. The fact that they were being forced to wait while that opportunity disappeared created resentment that would persist throughout the autumn campaign and beyond. When Third Army finally crossed into Germany in mid-September 1944, the moment lacked the drama soldiers had anticipated. There was no grand ceremony, no speeches, no sense that history was being made in real time. The first American soldiers to cross the German frontier and Third Army's sector did so during routine patrol operations, barely noticing they had left France until they saw German language signs, and different architectural styles in border villages. The anticlimax reflected both the soldiers' exhaustion and their focus on tactical objectives rather than symbolic milestones. First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges had beaten Third Army across the German border by several days. Entering Germany on September 12th, Patton noted to his wife in a letter that he feared he was off the first pages of newspapers for the moment. This competitive disappointment filtered down through Third Army ranks like a shockwave. Soldiers who had believed they would be first into Germany felt their achievement was diminished by being second. Some blamed the fuel shortage that had halted their advance in late August. Others blamed higher command decisions that allocated resources to other operations. The bitterness was real and deep. But the emotional impact of entering enemy territory was significant regardless of whether Third Army was first or fifth. Soldiers' letters and diary entries from mid-September reveal complex, conflicted feelings about setting foot on German soil. For many, crossing into Germany represented the culmination of years of preparation and months of brutal combat. They were now fighting in the homeland of the enemy who had started the war, brought devastation to Europe, killed their friends. The psychological weight of that realization affected different soldiers in profoundly different ways. Some soldiers expressed grim satisfaction at bringing war to Germany after years of German forces occupying other countries. One infantry private wrote to his family that he felt no sympathy whatsoever for German civilians who complained about damage from combat operations. He stated that Germans should have thought about consequences before starting a war, before invading Poland and France and Russia. This attitude reflected anger many American soldiers felt about what they had witnessed in France: destroyed towns, displaced civilians, evidence of German occupation brutality that couldn't be ignored or forgiven. Other soldiers expressed more complicated feelings that revealed the moral complexity of their situation. One officer wrote in his diary that entering Germany felt fundamentally different from liberating France. In France, American forces had been welcomed as liberators by grateful civilians who lined streets and wept with joy. In Germany, they were invaders in enemy territory. German civilians who remained in border villages showed fear rather than gratitude. This created psychological discomfort for some soldiers who had to balance their role as combat soldiers with their values as Americans who did not see themselves as conquerors or oppressors. The physical condition of German border villages provided soldiers with their first direct look at how the war had affected German civilians. Many border areas had been evacuated by German authorities, leaving ghost towns that American forces occupied without opposition. But some civilians remained, usually elderly people or families with young children who had nowhere else to go. Soldiers' descriptions of these encounters reveal genuine attempts to maintain professional conduct while fighting in enemy territory, to draw distinctions between enemy soldiers and enemy civilians. Third Army soldiers also noticed immediately that fighting in Germany was fundamentally different from fighting in France. German soldiers defending their own territory fought with determination and ferocity that exceeded what American forces had faced during the pursuit across France. Casualties increased sharply as German resistance stiffened. One battalion commander noted in his after-action report that his unit suffered more casualties in 1 week of fighting along the German border than in 3 weeks of pursuit operations across France. The war had changed again, and not in America's favor.